Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by New York Times bestselling author J. Randy Taraborelli. Taraborelli has a new book out, by the way. Have you read it yet? It's the follow-up to his 2023 book about Jacqueline Kennedy, Public-Private Secret. Now his latest book is about President Kennedy, titled JFK, Public-Private Secret. I just ordered my copy and I can't wait to dive into that. If you've read it, please drop a comment and let me know what you think. So today, I wanted to do a special episode of After Camelot devoted to Joan Kennedy, former wife of Senator Edward Kennedy. She was the last living link to the Camelot era until her death last month at age 89. She died exactly a year and a day after her sister-in-law, Ethel Kennedy, on October 9th. Her funeral in Boston brought the Kennedy family back together, and even at a time like this, when there is a lot of tension between them caused by RFK Jr. serving as health secretary in the Republican Trump administration, Bobby was there at the funeral. As you can see here in the photograph, he was a pallbearer for Joan, along with Timothy Shriver and three of his brothers, Chris, Max, and Douglas Kennedy. So for this episode about Joan Kennedy, I'm going to do this a little bit different this time. Unlike previous episodes where I just read one chapter at a time, I'm going to be jumping around in the book a little bit today, reading and discussing selected excerpts from several different chapters, focusing only on Joan to help us better understand her struggles in a very difficult, high-pressure life as a Kennedy wife. In episode 4, we already covered quite a bit of Joan's background, her training as a classical pianist, how she first met Ted Kennedy, the early years of their marriage, and how the Chappaquiddick incident affected her. You might want to go back and listen to that episode if you missed it. And in this episode today, we're going to pick up Joan's story after Chappaquiddick and follow her all the way into her old age, or at least until the year this book was released back in 2012. And if you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition of The Kennedys After Camelot, we're starting today on page 180. At the time of the 10-year anniversary of President Kennedy's death in 1973, the country was being shaken to its core by Watergate, which would result in the resignation of President Richard M. Nixon. In Ted and Joan Kennedy's home in McLean, Virginia, a more personal, emotional drama was unfolding. On November 6th, Ted noticed a reddened and painful-looking lump on his son's knee. Though Teddy Jr. had complained about it in the past, saying it had prevented him from playing football, his dad wasn't immediately concerned. After all, if Kennedy men worried every time they had a sports-related injury, there wouldn't have been time for much else in their lives. They were often hobbling around with one injury or another. Therefore, Ted let it go for a few days. However, when it seemed to be getting worse, he summoned a physician to his home. It was quickly decided that a battery of tests should be conducted at Georgetown University Hospital. On November 9th, Dr. S. Philip Caper met Ted at the Boston airport upon his arrival from a business trip to Washington. "I'm afraid your boy has a tumor in his leg," he told him as a stunned Ted just stood there in the airport. "It doesn't look good, my friend," said the doctor. His ominous words hit Ted like a freight train. "Are you saying he has cancer?" Ted wanted to know. The doctor nodded. "But he's just 12, Ted said in disbelief. That weekend, Ted played a game of father-son touch football with his boy, fearing that it could be the last time he would ever see him run freely. There would be some sort of surgery, he knew that, and it would probably involve the amputation of his son's leg. This emotional upheaval took Ted right out of his usual self-absorption, which wasn't surprising to those who knew him well. When his children, Kara, 13 at the time, Patrick, 6, and Ted Jr. faced any real crisis, he would always be there for them. There was no doubt about it, recalled his friend Senator John Tunney, Ted Jr.'s godfather. Obviously, the same was true of Ethel's kids and of Jackie's. He loved them all and only wanted the best for them. He felt a responsibility to them. He was never too busy for them. If they were sick, he would do the most amazing things to cheer them up. For instance, I recall once that when Douglas, Ethel's son, was sick, he invited the entire Washington Redskins team over to Hickory Hill to cheer them up. That was certainly going the extra mile. When it came to that third generation, they could always count on Ted. While Senator Tunney makes a good point about Ted as a father, it should also be noted that he was, at the same time, very tough on his boys, usually not willing to allow them any moment of apparent weakness. He and Joan fought a great deal, for instance, about how to treat Patrick's asthma. Though it was a serious medical concern, Ted saw it as something that needed to be overcome, not treated. Nothing annoyed him more than seeing the boy with his rescue inhaler, for instance, or seeing Joan trying to soothe him after he'd had an asthma attack. "You have to stop coddling the boy," Ted would tell her. As far as Ted was concerned, Joan overreacted when it came to problems with their children. She happened to be vacationing in Switzerland at the time of Ted Jr.'s diagnosis, and the last thing Ted wanted to do was call her and give her the news. He would later say he just didn't have the energy to deal with her. He waited as long as he could until finally, at the end of the weekend, he felt he had no choice but to telephone Joan. Of course, she was frantic with worry about Ted Jr. when her husband told her the news. After a biopsy was taken on November 13th and examined, it became evident that the initial prognosis had been accurate. Moreover, Ted Jr.'s leg would have to be amputated above the knee, and immediately, before the cancer could spread. There seemed to be some good news, though. Apparently, he had a cancer of the ligaments, as opposed to the more deadly bone cancer. Still, the survival rate was just 25%, and death could come within 18 months. The operation was scheduled for Friday, November 16th. How do you tell your 12-year-old son that he has cancer and will have to lose one of his legs? Ted was at a loss. Not knowing how to proceed, he needed time to think. In private, with his friend, Senator John Tunney, he had to wonder, once again, about the so-called Kennedy curse. "Maybe my generation, my brothers, we aimed too high," he told Tunney, "and we achieved it. We got what we set out to get. And I have to wonder if maybe there's a price to pay for wanting too much." The evening before Ted Jr.'s scheduled surgery, Joan returned to the States. Later that same night, Ted and the doctor sat down with Teddy Jr., without Joan, to give him the devastating news. "I'd heard and delivered more than my share of bad news in my life, but this was the worst of the worst," Ted would later recall. He further remembered that Ted Jr., quote, "started crying, and I was fighting back emotion with every ounce of my being. I held Ted in my arms and told him that I'd be there with him, that we'd face this problem together. It was the battle for his life, and I wanted to be on the front line." It was during the time of his son's medical crisis that Senator Ted Kennedy began to more fully understand the serious problems most Americans faced when it came to health care. "I guess you could call it the silver lining of what was going on at the time," Ted would later say, "that I developed a deeper understanding of something that would become one of the biggest interests of my life and my career." Most of the parents Ted met at the hospital in the months and years after his son's surgery, as his treatment continued, were simply unable to afford the kind of continuous treatment of their children that had been afforded to Ted Jr. Their insurance coverage wouldn't allow for the treatment for one reason or another. In some cases, the parents didn't even have coverage and would soon have to take their children elsewhere for treatment. Ted was astonished and saddened to find that some of the people he met at the hospital had no choice but to negotiate their way out of their financial predicament by trying to figure how much treatment they could actually afford and how much their child's life would then be compromised as a result, recalled Senator Tunney. He began to recognize how fortunate the Kennedys were and began to fully grasp the fact that had it not been for the family's wealth, power, and prestige, they very well could have lost Ted Jr. It was true. After all, Ted Sr. had the resources to fly doctors into Boston from all over the country to discuss various treatments and then to settle on one. He was able to see to it that the best doctors treated his son at the best hospitals. Certainly, money would never be an issue for the Kennedy family when it came to treating Ted Jr. Ted had all the money, all the insurance advantages, and all of the other resources necessary, including the kinds of connections most people would never even dream of, to take care of his son. In speaking to other concerned families at the hospital, the senator heard the stories of those who had borrowed as much as banks would allow in order to pay for their treatment, of those who had refinanced their homes in order to borrow against them, and others who had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. In most cases, there wasn't even a guarantee that the treatment, whichever one they had settled on, would work, as there rarely is in cases of cancer. He realized that there needed to be much more funding for cancer research so that perhaps a cure could actually one day be found, added Senator Tunney. Indeed, during the time that his son was sick, Ted came face to face with real Americans in crisis, both insured and uninsured, as well as the underinsured, and he would never forget the stories he heard and the friends that he made during this time. He knew now more than ever that he had to devote himself fully to health care reform in America, and also to better funding for not only cancer research, but the research of all illnesses. From this time onward, Ted Kennedy would steer his Senate Health Committee's work in that direction. And I'll just pause here to point out the irony. Some of you may know this, you might not, but Senator Ted Kennedy for years chaired the Senate Help Committee. That's the committee that had some oversight over Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Being approved as our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, which of course has caused this great split in the Kennedy family. Many of the Kennedys and many of their supporters now feel that RFK Jr. is undoing so much of the good work that his uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, did. And back to our story. Because Ted Jr. had a cold on the day scheduled for his surgery, the operation had to be delayed until November the 18th. This caused a bit of a scheduling conflict because Ted's niece, 22-year-old Kathleen, that's Ethel and Bobby's eldest daughter, happened to be getting married on that day to 26-year-old David Townsend. As father figure for the Kennedy clan, Ted had already agreed to give her away. He certainly didn't want to let her down, but he had to wonder if he was emotionally equipped to juggle such a joyous moment with the devastating one that was also scheduled to occur on that same day. He knew it would take everything he had to get through it, and he did. Very early on the morning of the 18th, Ted Sr. spent time with Ted Jr. at the hospital as he was awaiting surgery. He then left his son with Joan for several hours to perform his role at the wedding. He knew that he would return to the hospital as quickly as possible after the wedding ceremony. He drove a few blocks down the street to Holy Trinity and gave Kathleen away as promised. Singer Andy Williams was at the ceremony, and as he recalled, I sang Ave Maria, just as I had at Bobby's funeral 5 years earlier. Of course, it was a beautiful traditional wedding, Rory, who I think was about 4, and Douglas, who was about 6, were the ring bearers. The church was full of Kennedy friends and relatives, Sargent and Eunice, Jackie, Pat, Jean, and Stephen, the whole gang. Kathleen was in a classic long and flowing wedding gown picked out for her by her mother. Teddy was there, very distracted, but with his game face on. I recall that Joan stayed at the hospital with little Ted. Everyone was aware of the ordeal going on. Before Ted Sr. went back to the hospital, he made sure everyone would remember to sing the family's favorite song, When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. By the time his father returned to the hospital, Ted Jr.'s surgery had been completed, and he seemed to have come through it pretty well. Just when Ted Jr.'s family had begun to relax a bit after this ordeal, doctors conducted more tests and concluded that he did have bone cancer after all, and that it had spread to the remainder of his leg. Now it was time to fight, and fight harder than ever before, his father decided. As part of his quest to help his son, Ted summoned doctors from all over the country to meetings at his home to discuss new and maybe even experimental treatments to deal with cancer before finally settling on Dr. Edward Fry III of Boston's Children's Hospital. It was decided to treat Ted Jr. with an experimental drug called methotrexate, which was quickly becoming known for effectively destroying cancer cells. This chemotherapy treatment began on February 1st, 1974, and would continue for the next 2 years. It was especially grueling, lasting for 3 days and every 3 weeks, and involving hospital stays, intravenous drips, and the emotional tumult one might expect of such an ordeal. Helping Ted recover took precedence over every other activity in my life, Teddy would later recall, including my duties in the Senate. I slept beside him in his hospital room. I would hold his head against my chest when the nausea overcame him. In time, I learned the technique of injecting him myself. In the years to come, to his great credit, Ted Jr. would use his frightening teenage ordeal as the catalyst for his life's work as a healthcare attorney. As an adult, he would dedicate himself to advocating for cancer patients, first with the wellness community, as well as with his own healthcare advisory and financial services firm, the Marwood Group. I remember the emotional isolation I experienced, losing my hair, and dealing with that as a 7th grader, Ted Kennedy Jr. would later recall. No one ever asked me how I was doing, or thought that my mental attitude would have an impact on how I approached the challenges I faced. Even though my parents found the best, most brilliant doctors that existed at the time to treat the cancer in my body, no one ever really addressed how I was doing emotionally. Cancer had an enormous impact on how I approach my everyday life, says Kennedy. It sensitized me to a lot of issues for people facing cancer, and not just the psychosocial issues, but the legal issues as well. That's why I'm a health advocate. I also learned to pay attention to my body, not in a hypochondriac way, but to listen to what my body tells me. I think anyone who has faced a life-threatening disease really has a chance to reflect on his or her life. For me, I am incredibly grateful for everything today. In closing, he says, I have to credit my parents with my recovery. They really came together when it mattered most. They had their problems, as everyone knows, but when it came to their kids, they would come together and make it work and make us a real family. And now we're going to skip forward in the book. If you're reading along with me, we're going to go back in on page 236. This is during the 1980 presidential campaign when Ted Kennedy is deciding whether or not to run against President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic Party nomination. Perhaps it was easy to understand Ted Kennedy's concern, and that of most of his family, when it came to what some advisors began referring to as the Joan factor. The situation with Joan Kennedy could pose some potentially lethal problems to Ted's campaign should he decide to run. Still, wasn't this a matter for Ted to take up with Joan privately, since it had to do with their marriage? Some may have thought so, but that wasn't the way it unfolded. In the summer of 1979, Ted called a meeting of psychiatrists and doctors, some of whom had treated Joan in the past and some who had not, to confer with him, Joan, Jean, Ethel, Eunice, and his aide Richard Burke, to decide how to handle the problem at hand, namely Joan. It was decided to have the conference in a hotel at Crystal City, Virginia, territory deemed neutral and thus a safe zone to pose some difficult questions, such as, was Joan up to the challenge and rigors of a political campaign? If so, how would the Kennedy spin doctors be able to explain some of the particulars relating to her private life? By this time, Joan's face was appearing constantly on the covers of women's magazines, such as Good Housekeeping, The Ladies' Home Journal, Red Book, and McCall's, all with very personal interviews discussing her battle with alcoholism. Indeed, by the end of the decade, Joan's drinking problem was well known to anyone who cared to read about it. The avalanche of press had begun to roll back in February 1976 when Joan checked into the Smithers Rehabilitation Center in New York City for alcohol abuse. Coincidentally, a freelance writer had been in treatment at the same time as Joan. He sidled up to her one day, gained her trust, and from that moment took copious notes about her confessions during group therapy. He then sold Joan's warts and all story to the National Enquirer. More damage was done when other newspapers, including the Washington Evening Star, published reports based on the Enquirer's expose, infuriating the Kennedy family, particularly Eunice, who wrote an angry letter to the newspaper for having, quote, violated every canon of honorable journalism. It was quite a missive. You, who sit in splendid judgment of us all, whose lives can be saved or broken at your whim, she wrote, have turned thumbs down on a gallant and admirable woman. There's no triumph here for you, only deep shame. About a year earlier, Joan had moved out of the home she shared with Ted and the children and took an apartment in Boston. Most of the Kennedys were baffled by her decision. How could she just leave her husband and children to fend for themselves? That was certainly not the Kennedy way. Rose Kennedy told Joan that she'd wanted to take off many a time when she was married to Joseph, quote, but if we all did exactly as we pleased, what kind of world would this be, she asked. With the new living arrangement, Joan Kennedy would see her children on weekends and special occasions, while the help took care of them and Ted in her absence. All of it promised to be difficult to explain to Ted's constituents, thus the meeting. Joan wasn't told of the confab until the last possible moment, for fear that she would become so nervous about it she wouldn't show up. In a sense, it was handled as if it were an intervention. After Joan appeared at the hotel with her children, 19-year-old Kara, 18-year-old Ted Jr., and 12-year-old Patrick, she was quickly whisked away to a conference room. Once there, she was taken aback to see the other Kennedys present, along with a team of doctors. During the meeting, Ethel Kennedy made it clear that she felt Joan had licked her alcoholism. She didn't really understand it as a disease, but rather thought of it as an emotional problem that could be taken care of with therapy. Eunice had a better understanding of the situation and felt strongly that Joan still had a long way to go. The two women butted heads about it for a while until Ethel finally suggested that Joan stay with her at Hickory Hill, and that between the two of them they'd figure out a solution to the problem. Joan was against that idea, though. I'm not a child, she protested. Well, I want to be president, Ted finally said, cutting to the chase. I think the timing is right. I can do this. I believe I can win. People are sick of Carter, the energy crisis, the economy. People need a change, and that's me. However, he also said that if his aspirations would in any way hurt Joan, then, quote, forget it. It's not worth it. I won't do it. I will only proceed if I have the full support of everyone in this room, he said, including my wife. Joan's children also spoke up, all agreeing that the only way they would go along with their father's ambition to be president would be if their mother was for it as well. Joan then looked at Ted and said that she too wanted the presidency for him and that she would do whatever she had to do to help him reach that goal. I think you'd make a great president, Joan told Ted in front of everyone, but I need more time to work on myself. I really do. After some discussion, the decision was made that if Ted should in fact run, they would keep Joan's involvement in the campaign to a bare minimum. She would hold a single press conference at her home, which they would schedule for December 1979. It would be an event that Joan and her therapist could prepare for in earnest. Then, if that went well, she might make appearances with Ted on the campaign trail. Okay, kiddo, then it's settled, Ethel said. I, for one, am looking forward to us being in the White House, and I think Ted can do this country a lot of good. Oh, I'm so proud of you, Teddy, she exclaimed, jumping up to embrace him. Isn't this just great? It sure is, Ethie, Ted said, embracing Ethel. It sure is. Eunice wasn't so sure. Not only was she worried about Joan, but she was also savvy enough to know that America was going to have a lot of questions about what was going on with her marriage to Ted. Sarge and I see a lot of roadblocks down the line, she warned everyone. The way the climate is now after Watergate and, she paused, Chappaquiddick, she said after a beat. People are really looking at the character of their candidates and their wives. I think this is going to be a big problem. Jean had to agree with Eunice. We're going to have our work cut out for us to try and explain away all of this? Ted nodded. It's not going to be easy, he said. Then, looking at Joan, he asked, Are you up for it, Jonesy? Joan answered Ted with total silence. She must have known in that moment, though, that her options were limited. She already felt such tremendous guilt for having presented so many problems to the family as a result of her personal problems, noted her former assistant, Marcia Chellis. How could she now deny them their last chance at the presidency? Besides that, as she would later tell it, she so believed that Ted Kennedy could make a difference in this country, she didn't want to be the reason that he could not run for office. Yes, of course, I want to try, Joan Kennedy said at the meeting. More than that, I will do it. You'll see, she told Ted. You'll be proud of me. He smiled at her. That's my Jonesy, he said, patting her on the shoulder. Everyone left the meeting feeling somewhat encouraged. Before Senator Ted Kennedy even had an opportunity to officially announce his campaign, there was a serious public relations problem concerning a televised interview he would do with CBS Television's Roger Mudd. Ted gave the interview to Mudd from his summer home on Squaw Island for a CBS special broadcast. However, after it was over, the CBS crew was concerned that they'd gotten nothing of substance from the senator. He had been evasive and even seemed somewhat unprepared. When Roger Mudd asked for another interview, Ted reluctantly agreed to it. It was during that second interview, then, that Roger Mudd asked the big, headline-making questions relating to Chappaquiddick. Ted felt cornered, as he later recalled, because he never expected those, claiming his agreement with Roger Mudd had specified no questions about Chappaquiddick. After the two interviews were completed, Ted was unhappy enough about the results that he telephoned Roger Mudd to request a third interview. In that third interview, which took place at Ted's office in Boston, Roger Mudd pointedly asked Ted about the state of his marriage to Joan. Well, I think we've had some difficult times, Ted said, seeming unable to find the right words. But I think I think, been able to make some very good progress. And I would say I'm delighted that we're able to share the time and relationship that we do share, unquote. He could not have answered the question more disastrously. When asked if he and Joan were separated, his response was, quote, "Well, I don't know whether there's a single word that should have a description for it," unquote. Holy shit, Ted. Just reading that back, it's like, what? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what? What did he just say? And the really sad thing I just want to add about the infamous Roger Mudd interview. Roger Mudd had been a very close friend of the Kennedy family. He had literally been standing there next to Ethel when Bobby was shot in 1968. He comforted her. He socialized with the Kennedys. That's exactly why he was chosen to do the big interview with Teddy in 1979. And of course, because it was such a disaster, he was on the outs with the Kennedys after that. He was excommunicated from Hyannisport, and I don't think they ever spoke to Roger Mudd again, and they blamed him for the interview that went so badly for Ted. But I just want to say, as a journalist myself, I've been doing journalism for 35 years, it's unheard of to give a senator or a subject of an interview 3 tries. Roger Mudd went above and beyond. He was trying to help Teddy. He gave him 3 tries at this interview, and Teddy still blew it. So it's really not fair, I think, what the Kennedys did to Roger Mudd. The statement of January 21st, 1981 was short and concise. With regret, yet respect and consideration for each other, we have agreed to terminate our marriage. It was decided that Patrick, who is 13, would live with his father at the Kennedys' home in McLean, Virginia. Cara, 20, and Edward Jr., 19, were in college. Joan would continue to live alone in Boston. It would be 2 years before the divorce would be final. Alexander Forger would negotiate a lump sum for Joan of about $5 million from Teddy, as well as monthly alimony. She would also receive the condominium in which she had lived since 1977, and the house that she and Ted had shared on Squaw Island near the Kennedy compound. Barbara Gibson was with Rose Kennedy when Ted called to give her news of the divorce. "Yes, dear," Rose said, according to Barbara's recollection of her side of the conversation. She was very calm. "I see, dear," she said. "So is there somebody else?" she asked. "I'm so sorry," Jackie told Joan when she called to see how Joan was faring, according to what Joan would later recall, "because now I feel that I should have told you to do this 15 years ago. I just didn't know back then what we know today," Jackie said. The two were talking on the telephone shortly after the divorce announcement was made. Jackie went on to say that she felt terrible because she reasoned if she had encouraged Joan out of the marriage sooner, quote, "maybe you wouldn't have gotten so sick," she said, referring to Joan's alcoholism. "But I couldn't have done it anyway," Joan responded. "Times were so different. We did the best we could back then, though, didn't we?" Jackie had to agree. "We sure did," she concurred, "with what we had to work with anyway." The conversation brings to mind a letter that Jackie wrote to Joan in the summer of 1979. Reading it, one has to wonder if Jackie's views hadn't sprung from her own personal experience. She wrote that she suspected Ted had arranged to have his long-distance phone calls billed to their mutual friend, the architect John Carl Warnecke, so that Joan would be unable to monitor them. This had to have hurt Jackie. She liked Warnecke a great deal and had even dated him several times after JFK was killed and before she married Onassis. Thus, Jackie wrote, quote, He is able to talk to Mootsie or Pootsie every night, right in the house with his wife and children, and then bring them there when you're away. What kind of woman but a sap or a slave can stand that and still be a loving wife and care about him and work like a dog for him campaigning, she continued. This is the 20th century, Jackie wrote, not the 19th, where the little woman stayed home on a pedestal with the kids and her rosary. Your life matters just as much as his. You love him, but you can't destroy yourself. You are the mother of 3 children, and they're your children, and you want to be around to bring them up as you feel they should be brought up. A mother is more important to children than a father, Jackie posited. That is the parent it hurts children most to lose, and you are not going to let that happen. Joan later said that Jackie's letter so touched her, she cried upon reading it. Despite everything she had been through with Ted, though, Joan Kennedy was still unsure if she'd made the right decision to let him go. Perhaps that's why, on the very afternoon that the Kennedys made public that they were ending their marriage, Ted received a huge basket of colorful tulips and poppies delivered to his office. They were from Joan. And I'm skipping forward now to page 258. We're going to talk a little bit about Ethel's son, David Kennedy, who died of an overdose in 1984. We're picking up the story just about a year before his death. Perhaps no one in the Kennedy family understood what David was going through better than his long-suffering aunt, Joan Kennedy. Because she had been battling an addiction to alcohol and prescription pills for so many years, she could obviously relate to David's complex emotional issues, and she also understood what it was like to feel like a complete outcast in this close-knit family. She certainly never felt that she belonged either. When she saw David at a family function, the two had a chance to really talk, and David confided in her. He said that he felt everyone in the family was staring at him during the ceremony because they know I'm a junkie. I'm sorry I'm so weak, he told Joan. I just don't want you or anyone else I love to lose faith in me. He also told his aunt that he felt he wasn't good enough to be a Kennedy, and that all he had done in recent years was bring shame upon my family. Joan somehow got David to admit to her that he was using everything from pot to coke to heroin to Demerol to methadone, and that he was also drinking heavily. He also claimed that his Uncle Ted had been so tremendously upset with him recently that he, quote, threatened to lock me away, like his sister Rosemary, for the rest of my life in some psychiatric facility. Joan was understandably upset by everything her nephew had just revealed to her. Had Ted actually said that to David? Of course not, Jonesy, he said when she confronted him. I would never say such a thing to him. Why would he tell you that? I think we should have an intervention, Joan suggested to Ted in a meeting with him, Richard Burke, Stephen Smith, Eunice and Sergeant Shriver, and several other people, including key Kennedy family PR people and attorneys. A strong proponent of therapy for some time now, Joan firmly believed in the value of carefully executed interventions, a therapeutic process during which the addict's friends and family members confront him to remind him of the consequences of his actions, and also to tell him how those actions have affected them, and most important, to make it clear that if he doesn't get help, they will cut him out of their lives. I've done a lot of research into this, Joan said, extracting a stack of brochures from her large purse. I've talked to a number of doctors and psychiatrists, and here's what they've told me. She spent about 30 minutes detailing the possible benefits of an intervention. Everyone was quite impressed. Well, I think that's just a marvelous idea, Eunice decided. She said that she too had talked to several psychiatrists about that very subject, And, as she put it, I am totally convinced of its viability as a solution. Sergeant Shriver, though, wasn't so sure. He was concerned that it would appear to David as if everyone was piling on him. That will just piss him off, Sarge offered. Then what? It has to be Effie's decision then, Ted said, according to a recollection of the meeting. Let's run it by her and see what she thinks. I agree with Jonesy, though. We have to do something. And I like this idea. Good one, Jonesy, he said, smiling at her. She beamed back at him. It must have been a good feeling for her to know that she had contributed something important. When the drastic idea of an intervention was later presented to Ethel Kennedy at a follow-up meeting, she, like Sarge, expressed some ambivalence. She agreed that David might feel that everyone was ganging up on him, and she wasn't sure what good that would do him. In the end, though, she had to admit that she was at the end of her rope, so she agreed to it. She decided, though, not to be a part of it. God knows he knows how I feel, she explained, and we're at such odds right now, he'll just start lashing out at me. And to tell you the truth, I can't take it. Everyone understood. So David's brother Joe and I planned the intervention at a nearby hotel, Richard Burke later recalled. To my memory, all of his brothers and sisters were present. We had a psychiatrist there who acted as a mediator. We had a facility lined up, and the plan was to take David right over there from the hotel. They all told David how much they loved him and how disappointed in him they all were, and that if he didn't straighten up his act, they were going to stop communicating with him. It was standard intervention material, very tough, very upsetting, lots of tears. I recall that when someone brought up that his Uncle Teddy was disappointed in him, David really lashed out. The way he drinks, David said, and the way he has lived his life, and the way he's treated Aunt Joan, how does he get off being disappointed in me? To be honest, I don't think it did any good, Richard Burke continued. I'm not sure we understood the depth of his shame, that the guilt he felt about the relapses was partly responsible for his wanting to continue to medicate himself, if you will. He was so ashamed, and he kept saying as much. Even with the shrink there, I just had a feeling we were in over our heads with this thing. He absolutely refused to go to the facility, and short of dragging him over there, what could we do? The next day, I reported back to the senator that I didn't think the intervention had been successful. He was crestfallen. God damn, he told me. I don't know why, but I just thought it would work. I really did. The next couple of years would amount to only more of the same for David Kennedy. Unsuccessful treatments at rehabilitation centers, followed by relapses, unhappiness, shame, and despair. He would lose track of the many meetings he would take with his Uncle Ted about possible strategies to help him with his addictions. Quote, I am always being chewed out by my uncle, he would say at the time, and I feel really bad about it. The whole thing is messed up. And I'm going to take you forward in the book to page 358 and how Joan reacted to Ted getting remarried. It had become clear to most observers by the end of 1991 that Ted Kennedy was quite serious about Victoria Reggie and that he intended to marry her if she would have him. Ted made it official on January 14th, 1992, when he proposed to Vicky during a performance of La Boheme at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. The couple kept it a secret for a couple of months before telling all of their children in March. The official announcement was made on March 16th. The press, of course, immediately contacted Joan Kennedy for comment. Unfortunately, she didn't know anything about any of it and was taken completely by surprise. She seemed rattled by the call from a reporter from the Boston Herald. "Oh, is that true?" she asked when told of the announcement. "I can't talk now," she said, before abruptly hanging up. She was very upset. She spent a couple of weeks in seclusion, not speaking to anyone but her closest friends. It wasn't that she had any hope of reconciling with Ted, said one, but, there was always that little part of her that wondered if maybe... And this announcement ended that for her and made her come to terms with the fact that he was gone from her for good. It wasn't easy. I'm not sure she ever fell out of love with him, even after all that had happened. So yes, it was hard. I know she spoke to Jackie about it, also to Ethel and Eunice, though I don't know exactly what their conversations entailed. Joan simply would not discuss it. In 1993, Ted Kennedy and his nephew Joseph, Bobby's son, found themselves embroiled in controversies involving their marriages and the Catholic Church. It started with Joseph Kennedy II, known as Joe. Back in February 1979, he married Sheila Brewster Rausch. She was a bubbly, enthusiastic person, full of life, and someone the Kennedy family seemed to like a great deal. The couple went on to have twins in 1980, Matthew Rausch Kennedy and Joseph Patrick Kennedy, who, of course, went on to become a congressman from Massachusetts. However, when their marriage hit a rough spot in 1990, it never recovered and ultimately ended when Sheila filed for divorce. It was granted in 1991. 2 years later, Joe Kennedy became involved with a former staffer named Anne Elizabeth Kelly, known as Beth. Earlier in 1986, when Joe won his first election to Congress, succeeding former House Speaker Tip O'Neill in Massachusetts' 8th Congressional District, Beth had gone to Washington with him to work for him there. They soon fell in love, and now he wished to marry her in the Roman Catholic Church. However, he couldn't because the church doesn't recognize divorce. Like his Uncle Ted and his Aunt Pat before him, both of whom were divorced, he was also unable to partake in the sacraments of the church, such as Holy Communion or confession. For Ted, this had been an issue ever since his divorce from Joan. He was deeply religious, his faith handed down to him by his parents. "The most important element in human life is faith," Rose Kennedy said. "If God were to take away all his blessings, health, physical fitness, wealth, intelligence, and leave me with but one gift, I would ask for faith in him and his goodness, mercy, and love for me, and belief in everlasting life. I believe I could suffer the loss of my other gifts and be happy." "I am an American and a Catholic," Ted had said in 1983 in a speech he gave at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. Quote, "I love my country and treasure my faith." As much as he loved his religion, Ted defied the church on issues such as abortion and later gay marriage, believing that the Catholic faith was too restrictive and exclusive. Privately, he thought some of the church's laws were unfair, but it was the Catholic Church's rules that governed him. Other than making his opinions known and continuing his work in the Senate for change in certain laws, there seemed nothing more he could do. Or was there? After all, Kennedy was a lawmaker himself, and in a sense, he was used to making changes to rules and regulations. Why should this be any different? In discussing the situation with lawyers and family priests, Ted wondered what the chances might be of having his marriage to Joan annulled. An annulment would signify that the marriage was not really recognized in the Catholic Church. It was usually granted very soon after a marriage had taken place, because a marriage was materially flawed in some way, by fraud, for instance, or lack of judgment, or some other misunderstanding, such as a claim from one of the spouses that he or she had been mentally incapable of entering into the union. But there were cases, the Kennedys learned as they looked into it, of annulments being granted years after the fact. Indeed, they were stunned to learn just how many annulments were granted every year, as many as 60,000. Most of them were to eradicate short-term mistakes, but quite a lot were to rid people of marriages that had lasted for decades. Once he realized that an annulment might be an option, Ted Kennedy decided he wanted to pursue it, and in fact, he couldn't believe that it had never before occurred to him. One thing he knew for certain was that he could usually convince Joan to acquiesce to his wishes, and it would be fair to say that he'd taken advantage of that from time to time, but this was really pushing it, and he knew it. "Do you think we can get Joan to agree to such a thing?" he asked one of his attorneys in a meeting. "Gosh, Ted, I don't see how," the attorney answered, according to his memory of the conversation. "I know," Ted allowed. "I've been such a prick to her over the years. Why the hell would she?" The two men stared at each other for a moment. "I have to try, though," Ted decided. "Jonesy knows how much my faith means to me. Maybe she'll cut me some slack." "Maybe," said the attorney. At just about the same time that Ted Kennedy was trying to figure out how to proceed with Joan, Joe Kennedy decided to move ahead with an annulment from his own ex-wife, Sheila. He asked for the annulment and filed the appropriate papers with the Boston Archdiocese in 1993. Sheila immediately opposed the idea. Then, when the Boston Archdiocese seemed to drag its feet on the issue, Joe went ahead and married Anne in a civil ceremony at his home in Brighton, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, Ted also went forth with his own annulment from Joan. When he asked Joan for it, she agreed to it, much to everyone's surprise. Perhaps it was because of the way Ted had appealed to her, sitting down with her and apologizing for the many years of torment that he had caused her. This was certainly a new Ted, the Ted that seemed to have manifested itself from his new relationship with Vicky. The old Ted would have just stated his case and walked out the door, but the new Ted atoned for his sins and tried to make things right with Joan. He said he was sorry for everything that had ever happened between them, that he loved her and wished her well, that he wanted nothing more than to commit himself to his spirituality, and that he couldn't do so without an annulment. It had nothing to do with his feelings for her, he told her, or his memories of their marriage, but only to do with the Catholic Church's laws, which he had to admit he viewed as archaic. Touched by him, as she always had been, and even more so by his honesty and kindness towards her, Joan simply could not turn him down. Thus she agreed to the annulment on the admittedly unusual grounds that Ted's marriage vows to be faithful to her had not always been honestly made. In time, the Catholic Church did grant the annulment. It was all done quickly and also, maybe more importantly, quietly. There was no mention of it in the press. One of the reasons Joan agreed, say those who knew her well, was because she was worried about the divisiveness Ted's marriage had caused within the family. She wished to set an example to her children that if she could put her personal feelings aside for the sake of Ted's happiness, perhaps they could as well. It was a difficult decision for her to make, said Joan's former personal assistant, Marcia Chellis. After all she had been through with him and their marriage, to then say, okay, the union was never legitimate, was, well, it was gut-wrenching. But it was Joan's decision just the same. Unfortunately for Joe Kennedy II, Sheila Rausch was no Joan Kennedy. And we're moving forward now to page 366, all about Joan trying to make peace with the new wife. The new wife likes things done a certain way, Joan Kennedy told one of her sons in the summer of 1992. And I guess that's her prerogative. Still, it can be hard. The new wife, that would be Vicky, certainly did make a big impression as soon as she and Ted Kennedy married, and it wasn't always a good one. The first thing she did was have no trespassing signs posted on the beach in front of the big house in Hyannisport. For decades, the Kennedys had always allowed their neighbors to cross the beach in front of their home as a shortcut, or even just to take a nice walk. No one ever bothered the family. It had just always been that way. That is, until Vicky moved into the big house. Suddenly, signs went up to prevent access, and most people didn't take it well. It was as if she was sending a bigger message. No interference in her marriage. No trespassing there, as well as on the beach. When Ted's 3 children and their own families showed up at the house unannounced, it bothered Vicky. She therefore asked that they call first as a courtesy. She also had locks installed in the pantry to keep them and others from raiding the refrigerator. Vicky fired the longtime cook at the house and hired someone new who specialized in healthier gourmet cooking. Needless to say, it became quite contentious between Ted's children and his new wife. Ted tried to stay out of it by saying that he trusted the new wife's judgment, which didn't make matters any easier for his children. My impression of it, said a longtime friend of Vicky's, was that Vicky had heard all the stories of the way the family ran roughshod over Joan, and she wasn't about to let it happen to her. Maybe she went a little overboard, but she was trying to make a point early on, which was that she had her boundaries and she wasn't about to let anyone cross them. To say that some of her decisions created uneasy situations would be putting it mildly. For instance, the pool at Rose and Joe's home had always been open to all of the Kennedys. It only made sense. It was the Kennedy compound, after all. However, when Vicky moved in, she quickly became tired of having her pool filled with noisy Kennedys and their children and grandchildren. Enough is enough, she decided. There's a whole ocean out there. Why is everyone in our pool? She had little signs put up around the pool indicating quite clearly that the pool area was reserved for Ted Kennedy's immediate family only. One can only imagine the reaction those signs generated from the other Kennedys. One day, Ethel walked out of her home and over to the big house and, much to her astonishment, found Joan Kennedy in the pool with her daughter, Kara, and her children. This was a direct violation of the new rules. After all, Joan was no longer immediate family. Such family drama had put Ethel in a bad position in any case. Her first loyalty was always to Ted. Everyone knew that. But still, she loved Joan, too. In the end, she just didn't want any trouble. As she comically put it at the time, I am way too old for trouble. "Jonesy," Ethel called out to her former sister-in-law, "what are you doing in the pool?" Joan didn't hesitate. "I'm babysitting Ted's grandchildren," she said. Ethel laughed. "Good answer, Jonesy, good answer." In all fairness to Vicky, there was no way she would have evicted Joan from the pool anyway. To hear Joan tell it, the 2 women actually met on an airplane flying over Nantucket shortly after Vicky started dating Ted. I didn't know her at the time, but she came over, introduced herself, and said she'd had the occasion to meet all 3 of my children, Joan later recalled. She said they were wonderful people, so unspoiled. I was very flattered. It was like mother to mother. Vicky then reached out to Joan shortly after marrying Ted to see if there was some way the 2 women could work together to achieve harmony. They liked each other. There was no bitterness between them. In fact, one story has it that Vicky was sitting out on the veranda of the big house one day when she saw a lone figure walking on the beach, all bundled up in a coat and scarf. "Who is that?" she asked the maid. "I don't know," the maid replied, then asked, "Shall I tell her she's trespassing?" No, Vicky decided. She wanted to check it out for herself. When she got out onto the beach, she realized it was Joan. The 2 women greeted each other and spoke for a few moments. It's not known what they said. Then they continued walking down the beach, talking to each other as they made their way. Any rapport Vicky and Joan shared was not accidental. According to all accounts, they had to work at it and talk through problems whenever they arose. Understandably, situations sometimes arose that couldn't be avoided. For example, every year, even after the divorce, Joan had still spent Christmases with Ted and their children at Ted's home in Virginia. After he married Vicky, though, that no longer seemed appropriate. Also, Joan had customarily spent every Thanksgiving at the compound with Ted and their children. Again, right after he married Vicky, this too seemed no longer possible. Thus, the first few Thanksgivings were very hard on Joan. There would end up being 2 turkeys, one for Ted and family, and then one the children would bring to Joan and share with her. In the coming years, though, Vicky felt comfortable inviting Joan to her Thanksgiving table, and Joan appreciated the invitation and accepted. She then joined her ex-husband, his new wife, and all of their children and grandchildren for Thanksgiving at the big house, and did so for many years afterward. Vicky is very cognizant of treating my mother with due respect, said Ted Jr. at the time. She realizes that my mother deserves something. And moving forward now to page 478 of After Camelot, we're going to move forward about 10 years in time. In March 2005, life took yet another sad turn for Joan Kennedy, who was now 68. Still battling alcoholism, Joan relapsed yet again, and this time in a very public way. She took what ABC News later described as, quote, a drunken fall in Boston, and was found lying bleeding and alone on a Beacon Hill sidewalk. She said she was okay, but she did not look okay, recalled Constance Bacon, who shielded the helpless Joan from the rain as they waited for an ambulance. She was conscious. She had just hit her head pretty hard. She knew that she had fallen, and she tried to get up, and she couldn't. So I just waited until the ambulance came. I had no idea who she was. Unfortunately, Joan's fall resulted in a concussion and a broken shoulder. When the accident made the national news, it was difficult for those who loved and cared for Joan to realize that she was still waging what, at least from all outward appearances, seemed to be an unsuccessful battle against alcoholism. She had always been such a generous and caring person. It was difficult to reconcile that she was still in great turmoil and pain. From the hospital, Joan called her son, Ted Jr., who then called Patrick and Kara with the upsetting news. When Patrick arrived at the hospital, he looked exhausted and extremely upset. You want to make sure there's someone there for her all the time, he said. But at the same time, you don't want to encroach on her privacy too much. When things like this happen, it makes you feel as though maybe you should have done more to make sure there's someone with her 24/7, and perhaps that might become necessary. Soon after, Patrick announced that he was dropping his plans to run for the Senate in 2006, a move he had been contemplating for some time that would have seen him challenge Republican Senator Lincoln Chafee. My family means too much to me, he said, obviously referring to his mother, since he was not married and had no children. After that very troubling incident, Joan's children intervened in her affairs, obtaining a court-ordered guardianship that put Ted Jr. in charge of his mother's care and her $9 million estate. The details, found in papers filed in Barnstable Probate and Family Court on Cape Cod, were disturbing. It was alleged by her children that Joan had stopped attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and had been surreptitiously drinking vanilla extract and mouthwash in an attempt to become inebriated, so much, in fact, that she had done damage to her kidneys. if she continued at the rate she'd been going, doctors feared she could end up on dialysis within a year. They also stated that Joan had been suffering from bipolar disease and depression as well as alcoholism. In the end, Barnstable Judge Robert Terry ruled that Joan was, quote, incapable of taking care of herself by reason of mental illness. It was at this same time that Joan's children found out that she had transferred the title of the Squaw Island home, the house she and Ted had owned for many years and which she got as part of her divorce settlement from him, to a trust that was to be controlled by Webster Jansen, a man that Ted Jr., Patrick, and Kara claimed to not even know. Understandably, they became suspicious and feared that someone was taking advantage of their mother in her emotionally weakened state. The result was an awful family feud that left Joan feeling bullied by her children, as if she had no power over her own life and affairs. She retaliated by putting the Squaw Island house on the market. As far as her children were concerned, this was the proverbial last straw. They loved that house. They'd grown up there, felt it was their house as well as their mother's, and weren't going to allow it to be sold. Basically, my mother is taking out on us by trying to sell the house, Ted Jr. said at the time. So how did all this happen? It started a couple of years earlier, in the spring of 2003, when Joan's second cousin, Webster Jansen, picked her up from her home in Boston to drive her to Maine to visit relatives there. On the trip, Joan seemed particularly anxious. She had just been released from a treatment facility in Blairstown, New Jersey, after a 7-month stay, and as she explained to Jansen, quote, "It cost me a fortune. I'm very worried about my family and my future," Joan said. "I'm getting older. I feel I need to be saving money, not spending it." "Well, what about Ted and the kids?" Jansen asked. "Surely they can help you out." Joan shook her head and didn't respond. Her relationship with Ted was fine, mostly because she kept him out of her business and he didn't ask any questions. They had been divorced for more than 20 years, and of course, he was now married to Vicky. He'd just barely been available to Joan during their marriage, so she certainly didn't expect much from him now, other than simple kindness, which he did offer. However, Joan's now grown children were a different story. Joan was adamant that she didn't want them telling her what to do, yet she was always in such emotional distress that it was difficult for them to stay out of her affairs. The more they pushed to help her, the more she felt her freedom being chipped away. As much as they all loved one another, there was a great deal of anger and disappointment bubbling just under the surface. It was a family dynamic that had been many years in the making, going all the way back to when Joan left home to move into her own apartment in the early 1980s. By 2005, she had been in and out of rehabilitation centers for the better part of 30 years. It had not been easy on anybody. "Maybe I can help you," Webster Jansen offered as he drove Joan to Maine. As it happened, Jansen had grown up with Joan in Bronxville. His mother, Belle Bennett, and Joan's, Ginny Bennett, were cousins. He had been a frequent date at school functions, an usher at her wedding to Ted, and he recalls he danced with Jackie at the reception, and he had maintained a relationship with her over the years. He was one of the first to call her after the Chappaquiddick incident back in 1969. Because he'd worked on Wall Street as a trust investment officer at Citibank and Morgan Guaranty Trust, he felt qualified to help Joan. "I'll take a look at your portfolio and we'll see what we can do," he said. When I looked at her portfolio and saw how her investments had been managed, I realized she really could benefit from my experience, Jansen later recalled. "I thought I could help her, that I would give her the best advice." Joan and Webster came to an arrangement whereby she would pay him by the hour to advise her on her assets, which he found in looking at the books came to about $9 million. However, since her money was hopelessly entangled in mortgages and other long-term investments, Joan had good reason to be worried. She was cash poor. For the next 18 months or so, Joan and Jansen continued to work on her finances and straighten out myriad problems. I would come to Boston once a month and we would sit down and try to figure it all out, he said. Without getting into too much detail, a lot of people had taken advantage of her. She's a very nice person and somewhat naive. I found that she wasn't knowledgeable about her investments or finances and was really in over her head. "What about the house on Squaw Island?" Webster asked Joan during one of their meetings. "How often do you actually go there?" Joan said she stayed at the home about 2 months out of the year, every summer. "It's not worth it then," Webster advised her. "I think you should sell it. You could probably get about $7 million for it. That would put money in your pocket, and you wouldn't have to worry for the rest of your life." Joan seemed relieved. It sounded like a very good idea. Therefore, she and Jansen established a trust, transferred the title of the Squaw Island house to it, and prepared to sell it. When Joan told Ted that she was working with Webster Jansen, he said he was happy about it. He said he was relieved that she'd found someone she could trust, and he was happy not to have to worry about her. Apparently, Joan decided not to tell her children that she was working with Jansen, and Ted didn't give them that information either. In fact, the children didn't know a thing about Jansen until Joan had her street accident in Boston, and they began delving into her affairs. "Who the hell is this guy?" Ted Jr. asked his mother. "It's none of your business," Joan told him. "These are my affairs, not yours." It was when Joan Kennedy put the Squaw Island house on the market that her children, Ted Jr., Patrick, and Kara, decided to take her to court over the sale of the property, with a trial being set for June 2005. They also wanted the interloper Jansen out of the picture. It was all very unfortunate, extremely disrespectful to Joan, that's how Jansen put it, and couldn't have done much to ease Joan's unhappiness at the time. However, in their defense, Joan's children were genuinely worried. They didn't understand why she felt it necessary to keep her relationship with Webster Jansen a secret, and they were very concerned. It got ugly. In the end, Joan didn't have the strength or the energy to fight her children. A court case was avoided when she settled the matter by dissolving the trust established by Jansen and taking the Squaw Island house off the market. She also reluctantly agreed to strict court-ordered supervision with a guardian to make sure she did not drink. Meanwhile, her finances were to be handled by 2 court-appointed trustees. Tired and feeling overwhelmed, Joan then went into rehab again. This time, she was required to stay sober, otherwise her children would be granted permanent custody of her. Webster Jansen says, quote, "My reputation took a beating. Let's just say the Kennedys were not kind to me in the press. It never even occurred to me when I started helping her that there would be any opposition, since I was a family member and I had the qualifications. There were things that showed up in local newspapers impugning my professionalism and integrity, statements I could have sued them for, but I didn't want to go up against the Kennedy machine. It would have cost an arm and a leg and taken years in litigation. And quite frankly, I didn't want to drag Joan through it. It cost me more than you will ever know in time and personal anguish." Within 6 months of the settlement, Joan was much stronger emotionally and decided to put her foot down. She was selling the house, and that was the end of it. So she put the property back on the market for $6.5 million, just as she and Webster Jansen had originally intended. Ted had the right of first refusal, but apparently he didn't have the cash or the credit, since he was heavily leveraged on other properties, including the big house on the compound. Joan's children said they didn't have the money either. In the end, the house was sold to a stranger. If it had been sold under the trust that Joan and I had established, there would have been a provision that the new owner would have to allow Joan to lease it every summer for 2 months, as she had for years. That's what Webster Jansen said. But under the new arrangement, that was not possible. So it was all very sad. As of this writing, or rather when this book was published in 2012, Joan Kennedy is committed to her sobriety and attends Alcoholics Anonymous meetings 7 days a week in Boston, where she still lives. She remains sober. Her relationship with her children is still somewhat strained, but they continue to try to make it work. At the end of the day, we're family, Patrick Kennedy said, and as we've all learned over the years, it's family that matters most. When Ted died in 2009, his son Ted Jr., founder and president of the Marwood Group, a firm that advises corporations about health care and financial services, was 47 years old. Kara, who worked as the media director of her Aunt Jean's very special arts program, was 49. And Patrick, still a Rhode Island congressman, was 42. While Ted and Kara were leading well-adjusted, happy lives, Patrick still faced some significant challenges. In 2006, he was in a car accident that ultimately was the catalyst for another stint in rehab for abuse of sleeping pills. Today, he, like his mother, is sober, but he realizes that the work to stay that way will continue for the rest of his life. Joan Kennedy was devastated by Teddy's death. She'd never stopped loving him after all. Now all there was left to do was to grieve for her first, and it would seem, her only love. Joan attended the Mass at the big house that was said for Ted right after his passing and prior to the funeral. She wasn't sure that she should be present, saying that she didn't want to intrude. Of course she should be here, Vicky decided, and she called Joan and personally invited her. Ted loved her very much, she said. Her children love her, and they are grieving now, as I know Joan is. So this is a time for all of us to be together. Joan Kennedy's public appearances of late, first at Eunice's funeral in August of 2009, and then at Ted's 2 weeks later, reminded many people who perhaps had long ago forgotten not only her struggles as a Kennedy wife, but also her important place in the family's storied history. At one point, Joan was overheard telling President George W. Bush, "I admire your family so much because I know how hard it is staying close to one another when you're a political family." President Bush took both of Joan's hands and said, "You are a woman America holds so dear. Do you know that?" She just smiled and nodded her appreciation. About a week after Ted's funeral, the family convened once again in the parlor of the big house for hot coffee and warm memories. How many years ago was it that we were all in this same room celebrating Jack's election? Joan asked at one point, according to witnesses. "Remember, we took that family portrait right over there," she said, pointing to a corner. "Wow, how long ago was that?" Jean asked. "My gosh, next year it will be 50 years, Joan said, doing a quick calculation in her head. "I was just 22, she added. "So young to be at the center of all that history." "We were all so young," Jean said, now holding Joan's hand. "Do you remember how Jackie looked on that day?" The two women smiled at one another, a wave of nostalgia, no doubt, washing over them. "In some ways it seems like a lifetime ago," Jean Kennedy Smith concluded, "and in other ways, just yesterday." And that concludes this episode of the Kennedys After Camelot, a special episode dedicated to the life of the remarkable Joan Kennedy, who, I don't know about you, but I always thought that she was the prettiest of all the Kennedy wives, absolutely beautiful, stunning woman, and by all accounts, beautiful on the inside as well as out. I think we will all miss her. And so that is episode 6. We'll be back with episode 7. These are a bit out of order. I had planned to do the episode on Pat Kennedy and Peter Lawford for episode 6, but then Joan passed away, and I felt like, I think I'll put off the Pat and Peter episode and just take some time to remember and honor Joan Kennedy. So our next episode, episode 7, will be the Pat and Peter episode. I hope that if you are enjoying this series, you will take a moment to share that playlist link that's down in the comments with anybody else you know who's a Kennedy fan or interested in the Kennedys. Also, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. If you have any questions about the book or the Kennedys, leave me a comment or a super chat or a super thanks. And if you'd like to recommend a book for a future book club, you can go to my wish list at giftapp.com/real-Lori-Spencer, where you'll find a lot of really cool Kennedy books to choose from. You can buy one for me, and I will consider it for a future book club reading about the Kennedys. There's always lots and lots of good Kennedy content on this channel, and I hope that you're enjoying it. And so we'll be back with another episode of the Kennedys after Camelot very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.